Hello, everyone. For this video, I'm going to talk a little bit about the brain and trauma and the aftermath of the trauma, mostly associated with sexual assault, but the brain is affected by every type of trauma. And also, I'm going to have some of these sections that is related to trans and non binary people. However, the information is pretty much just universal. Like, it goes for anyone and everyone. But when it comes to trans and non binary, it goes kind of with a few added things, basically. So, an intriguing and a widely accepted theory about human brains is that they evolved to become more complex. This theory says that we have a reptilian brain that contains the basics for survival. It processes input from the senses, keeps the system functioning, governs reproduction, and is in charge of safety. We next developed a mammalian or limbic brain, found in all mammals, that evolved around and on top of the central reptilian brain. The limbic brain contains the circuits that handle emotions, memory, some social behavior, and learning. The third most recent and most complex layer is the neocortex. This is our thinking brain, that part that allows us to think through what is happening and override the reaction of the reptilian and the limbic brains when, for instance, we realize that the person who just jumped at us unexpectedly is a friend who is smiling and seeking to engage us in play. There is a built in hierarchy among these brain functions. The highest imperative of the brain is to keep the organism alive, which is the reptilian's brain first and most basic function. Faced with a threat to life, the reptilian brain shuts down all unnecessary functions, including not only digestion, muscle building, and reproductive drive, but also higher level thinking in order to divert all available blood and energy to the heart and muscles to power either fighting or fleeing. Should these two options not seem viable, the reptilian brain will choose a third, less well known option: freezing, folding, or fainting. All of these options can be observed in animals that are faced with becoming someone's prey. While the advantages of fighting or fleeing are obvious, freezing or folding can also be life saving if they cause the predator to lose interest, because many predators avoid dead prey in case it died of something that could kill the animal who dines on it as well. In addition, there are pain deadening aspects of freezing or folding that are merciful if the victim does not succeed in eluding, defeating, or distracting the predator. What many trauma survivors do not understand is that the thinking brain, the neocortex, effectively shuts down when our lives are threatened. Many survivors harshly criticize themselves later, wondering why they are so cowardly or dumb that they could not come up with a way of avoiding or more quickly escaping the situation. Trauma survivors need to understand that it is literally biologically impossible for people to access their thinking brain in life and death situations because the more primitive brain is choosing among its three basic options: flight, fight, or freeze. And creative problem solving abilities are, for the most part, completely offline. In fact, one study found that sexual assault seems particularly likely to provoke a biological freeze response. 88% of the victims of childhood sexual assault and 75% of the victims of adult sexual assault reported moderate to high levels of paralysis during the assault. What happens to the brain after the trauma is less clear, although there is no shortage of theories. Many theories focus on memories and why traumatic memories are so prone to come back as flashbacks, which are memories that feel like they are present reality rather than a memory. While they are so intrusive, and why they can't be forgotten for many years and then recovered. Some of these theories suggest that the brain's chemical bath is so different from normal during a trauma that the memories are encoded differently. Other theories suggest that since certain parts of the brain are offline during trauma, memories are stored in atypical places. These trauma theories, in turn, lead to trauma therapies. For example, one school believes that it is critical to use your neocortex and language centers of the brain to link your trauma memories into a story, because that process helps move memories into the more typical storage mechanisms and the in the process draining them of some of their potent emotions. Some trauma therapies, like EMDR, involve rapidly and repeatedly shifting focus from one side of the body to the other in order to activate both hemispheres of the brain and thereby integrate the memories. Another popular trauma theory is that humans short circuit the biological trauma response because of judgments about it. Animals recovering from a trauma often vigorously shake themselves or engage in other physical behaviors that reset their systems, whereas human trauma survivors often repress or suppress each reactions. Trauma therapies based on this view of trauma help trauma survivors gently move their body into the last known position before the trauma, and then carefully and slowly move them through the next actions the body wants to take, such as running or shaking. Older therapies often focus on having the survivor continually relive or retell their story until it ceases to hold so much emotional power. Newer analysis indicate this method is only effective if the victim's primary feeling is fear, which can be reduced if it is relived enough in safe environments. What is clear is that during a trauma in which someone feels their life is in danger, their brain is not operating normally. What is also clear is that their memories of what happened during the trauma are qualitative, qualitatively different from everyday memories. Although many people do manage to recover from these traumatic events on their own over time, many others carry psychological scars that can be debilitating. Some find that their lives began to be defined by the trauma. The new experience and memories all filtered through and into ways of thinking shaped by the trauma. It appears that sexual abuse is one of the traumas most likely to lead to PTSD. PTSD is the condition most directly traceable to trauma, with between 50% and 77% of sexual assault survivors suffering from it. Certain personal characteristics and experiences seem to increase the likelihood that the sexual assault survivor will develop long term symptoms. Experiencing previous traumas, even if they were caused by natural disasters rather than human actions, raises the chances of survivor will develop PTSD. If a person did not experience strong supportive relationships with their adult caretaker as a child, they will be more at risk. If they often dissociate, which is like psychologically moving out of your body into another place or time, they are more risk of PTSD, especially if they disassociated at the time of the trauma itself. If you are a sexual assault survivor, it is critical that you not blame yourself for being unable to prevent more quickly and forget or just get past the trauma. The experiences that you are now struggling with is not something that will just go away. The brain and its biological processes and the rest of your body took over when you were threatened or assaulted. That was making certain choices literally impossible. These same chemical and physical processes made semi permanent changes in your brain. Although spontaneous healing is possible given enough time and the right circumstances, it is more likely that you will need to engage in a long period of healing and self care, thoroughly grounded in compassion for yourself and the facts of biology. The after effects of sexual abuse or assault. After any sort of trauma, most people recover, either on their own or with the help of community members or professionals. However, sexual assault has widely been found to be the type of trauma most likely lead to long-term challenges. Studies of post-traumatic stress disorder, the type of condition, like I said, most directly traceable to trauma, shows that between 50% and 77% of sexual assault survivors end up meeting the criteria for PTSD. I've already said that before. I just said it and I'm going to say it again. 50 to 77% of sexual assault survivors end up meeting the criteria for PTSD. You're not alone. According to the 5th edition of Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders of the American Psychiatric Association, has PTSD defined as a person. Okay, so on this is like the questionnaire that they fill out. And for this question, only one is required. There's a couple of them that have two that is required, but for this question, the person was exposed to death, threatened death, actual or threatened serious injury, or actual or threatened sexual violence as follows. 1. Direct exposure. 2. Witnessing in person. 3. Indirectly by learning that a close relative or close friend was exposed to trauma. If the event involved actual or threatened death, it must have been violent or accidental. And number 4, repeated or extreme indirect exposure to aversive details of the events, usually in the course of professional duties, such as first responders collecting body parts, professionals repeatedly exposed to details of child abuse, etc. This does not include indirect non-professional exposure through electronic media, television, movies, or pictures. So with that question, only one box had to be checked. For B, another one with only one box to check. The traumatic event is persistently re experienced in the following way or ways. 1. Recurrent involuntary and intrusive memories. Note, children older than 6 may express the symptom in repetitive play. 2. Traumatic nightmares. Note, children may have frightening dreams without content related to the trauma or traumas. 3. Dissociative responses. Example, flashbacks, which may occur on the continuum from brief episodes to complete loss of consciousness. Note, children may reenact the event in play. 4. Intense or prolonged distress after exposure of traumatic reminders. Or 5. Marked psychological reactivity after exposure to trauma related stimuli. And then C, another one with just one box is required. Persistent, effortful avoidance of distressing trauma related stimuli after the event. 1. Trauma related thoughts or feelings. Or 2. Trauma related external reminders, people, places, conversations, activities, objects, or situations. And then number or letter D. For this one, 2 boxes are required. Negative alterations in cognitions and mood that began or worsened after the traumatic event. 1. Inability to recall key features of the traumatic event, usually dissociative amnesia, not due to head injury, alcohol, or drugs. 2. Persistent and often distorted negative beliefs and expectations about oneself or the world. 3. Persistent, distorted blame of self or others for causing the traumatic event or for resulting consequences. 4. Persistent negative trauma related emotions, fear, horror, anger, guilt, or shame. 5. Markedly diminished interest in pre traumatic significant activities. 6. Feeling alienated from others. 7. Constricted affect, persistent inability to experience positive emotions. And then for question E, it's also 2 boxes that require a check mark. Trauma related alterations in arousal and reactivity that began or worsened after the traumatic event. 1. Irritable or aggressive behavior. 2. Self destructive or reckless behavior. 3. Hypervigilance. 4. Exaggerated startle response. 5. Problem in concentration. 6. Sleep disturbances. F. Persistence of symptoms in criteria B, C, D, or E for more than 1 month. G. Significant systems related distress or functional impairment. H. Disturbance is not due to medication, substance abuse, or other illnesses. Okay, so in simpler terms, trauma survivors are diagnosed with PTSD if they show signs of each of the following for longer than a month: re experiencing the trauma through flashbacks, memories that feel like they are present reality rather than a memory, nightmares, remembering the trauma when they don't want to, or reacting strongly to things that remind them of the trauma, or avoiding normal parts of life that remind them of the trauma, altering their thoughts and feelings in a negative way, such as the negative belief about the self or the world, experiencing hyperarousal or being overly physically and or psychologically reactive to everyday events. Of course, what I just described are the clinical requirements of a medical diagnosis. The list of possible consequences of trauma is much, much longer. One of the most common after effects of trauma is having difficulty regulating one's emotions. Emotional regulation is the process of keeping your emotions at the level that does not overwhelm you. Some of this is undoubtedly due to the brain chemical changes trauma induces, which lead to the classic PTSD symptoms of re experiencing, avoiding, and hyperarousal. It is hard to have control over your emotions if your body and your mind are constantly struggling or constantly strongly reacting to threats or experiencing threats no one else experiences, either because you are having flashbacks or having misinterpreted an innocent event like someone suddenly coughing or even laughing loudly. If someone is traumatized as a child or a youth, chances are good that they missed out on some normal skill building due to being distracted by coping with the trauma. This may be especially true if the abuser was a parent, family member, teacher, or caregiver who would normally be teaching that child how to cope in the world, including how to cope with their emotions. Not only will the child have a complicated, possibly fearful relationship with their abuser or teacher, but the chances are good that the abuser will themselves not have good emotional regulation skills, which helped lead them to abuse in the first place. In any case, the young person simply does not acquire the strategies for calming and self soothing strong emotions. Finally, many psychologists and child development experts believe in attachment theory, which holds that how the primary caregiver or caregivers interact with the infant and young child not only sets lifelong patterns of relating in that child, but actually physically molds how that child's brain develops. This theory says that even if a parent or caregiver is not an abuser, if they do not respond adequately to the infant or child's needs, that child will develop a brain that is less capable of handling strong emotions and bouncing back from adversity, in other words, resilience, than other people's brains. One possible aspect of emotional regulation problems may be an inability to even identify what emotion one is having. The person who has this problem, also called alexithymia, usually answers, I don't know, or has only a very limited number of answers, such as upset or okay, when asked how they are feeling. Not only may they not know the words to put to what they are feeling, but they may even be unable to distinguish one type of feeling from another. Obviously, if you cannot even identify what you are feeling, it becomes much harder to learn strategies for constructively dealing with that feeling. As a result, many people end up using substances or behaviors like chronically working long hours or playing endless video games as a way to cope with any strong feeling. And then we move into isolation, avoidance, and denial. Despite how many transgender people are sexual assault survivors, you may not know many other survivors because trauma survivors often isolate themselves and or just do not talk about what happened to them. Some of this isolation may come from fear of being re-victimized or an unawareness that one's social skills are not as good as they could be. Self-isolation can also be a way of simply trying to lower the chances of being triggered or having something happen that causes a flashback or otherwise reminds the person of what they've experienced in the past. Avoidance is a similar tactic. If the person can structure their days to avoid being reminded of the trauma, they will have fewer painful memories and feelings. Denial can take many forms. One is to claim that while the trauma happened, it had no effect on the person has long since recovered and has no lingering effects. Another is to wonder if it even happened, or to claim that it was not nearly as bad of an experience as others. When some trans survivors of sexual assault were questioned about their past um, abuse, some answers that was given was, "It happened, I got over it. It had nothing to do with who I am today, except for making me a lot stronger and a bit harder on the outside and unable to fully enjoy sex." Large groups are scary. Large groups being more than two people who I don't know, or more than six people that I do know. I just wanted to forget about it. I was hesitant to claim that my abuse was real abuse and didn't want to take away services from or time from real survivors who needed them more. I made a deliberate effort to put events behind me and not think about them. And then a few of them even said that the survey itself was somewhat upsetting and that they would rather forget about that too. Although it is still a controversial subject, many people forget that they were ever sexually assaulted or abused, sometimes for years or even decades. Various developments may cause the memories to re emerge. Other common triggers for the re-emergence of forgotten abuse memories include parenting a child who reaches the age when the abuse happened to the parent, revelation of another family member's abuse, an illness, a loss of a partner, retirement, or some other major life change. Some people believed that they were in some way protected from their memories until they became strong enough to handle them. This does not necessarily mean the reemergence process is okay. Shame, guilt, and self blame. Shame is the feeling that you are damaged, unworthy, bad, dirty, wrong, unlovable, unfixable, dangerous, not good enough, broken, and or don't deserve to live. Although it should be what is felt by the perpetrator, the one who violated another person, used someone to meet their own needs, or betrayed or manipulated someone's innocence or trust. Instead, almost like a sexually transmitted infection, it ends up infecting the victim. Unfortunately, it doesn't feel like an outside infection to the victim. It just feels like who they truly are, not good enough, or not worthy of love and compassion. Shame can lead to a whole range of negative outcomes. It may help explain the isolation many survivors impose on themselves and or the avoidance of friendships or other relationships. It may be part of the reason why survivors often do not feel like they will live very long, and perhaps consequently why they may not bother planning for the future. It can lead people into partnering with individuals who abuse them again, because why should they deserve any better? People who feel shame often drown that feeling in alcohol or drugs, or bury it under a mountain of busyness and overwork. Guilt is related to shame. Shame is about who you think you are, whereas guilt is about a behavior you may have done. Guilt is a feeling that you have done something wrong. A sexual assault survivor who feels guilt may think that they should have known better than to have gone to someone's house on the first date, not to have that other drink at the bar, not to walk down that alley. The survivor who feels shame may think they are so flawed that they deserve the assault. Although both can lead to a survivor to blame themselves for the assault, guilt implies that one can learn to not do something again, while the survivor with shame feels unfixable. It is important to recognize that the new diagnostic criteria for PTSD has a new emphasis on negative alterations in cognitions and moods, specifically calling out persistent and distorted negative beliefs and expectations about oneself or the world, persistent distorted blame of self or others for causing the traumatic event or for resulting consequences, persistent negative trauma related emotions such as fear, anger, guilt, or shame. In other words, shame, guilt, and self blame are hallmarks of having been traumatized. They seem to come with the territory. That does not, however, mean that you have to continue to live with them. Depression, anxiety, self harm, and suicide. The finding that depression and anxiety both frequently accompany PTSD makes a great deal of sense. If you are having unwanted memories, experiencing emotions that seem out of control, are staying away from people and activities in order to lessen your chances of being triggered, are not sleeping well, are reacting strongly to small things most other people barely notice, blaming yourself for what happened, feeling depressed and or anxious seems pretty normal. It may also be important to note that depression and anxiety are the most common mental health conditions affecting the general US population as well. Some people cope with depression and anxiety by going to the doctor, a therapist, and or obtaining prescriptions. Probably the majority, however, attempt to cope on their own by self-medicating. This can mean dampening down the negative feelings through alcohol, prescription or non-prescription drugs, food, which could lead to either over or under eating, becoming completely obsessed about exercise or work or some other distracting activity, and self harming behavior such as cutting. Other people do, in fact, become suicidal. The National Transgender Discrimination Study found that overall, 41% of its transgender and gender nonconforming respondents had attempted suicide at least once. For those who had been sexually assaulted, the attempt rate went from up to 64%. These figures compare to 1.6% for the general population. In other parts, there in other parts and other surveys and stuff, some of these numbers are even higher because they separate them into categories of trans men, trans women, non binary femme, non binary mask. There's so many different categories that some of these surveys and stuff have been put into. So when you have 41% for trans, that is all inclusive. General non-trans at 1.6%, and then trans sexual assault survivors at 64%. That is a lot larger than the trans just in general. Sexual abuse within the community the numbers are high. The numbers are seriously high. Many survivors attempt to dampen or alter their difficult symptoms or painful memories through self-medication, typically alcohol, drugs, or food. Study after study finds high correlations between those who use substances to cope and those suffering from PTSD. While substance use can sometimes temporarily diminish symptoms such as nightmares, panic attacks, depression, and numbing, substance use is also associated with more trauma. Violence and accidents are more likely when one or more people are drunk or high. Although many trauma treatment programs will not accept people who are actively abusing substances, and many substance abuse treatments programs do not address trauma issues, there is a growing consensus that because of the interrelationship among trauma and substance use, simultaneous treatment is recommended. So, if you are using and you have been diagnosed with PTSD, it's okay to go ahead and seek a rehab. Some some will accept, some won't. But I noticed in some of the other studies and stuff that I was doing that a lot of rehabs are opening up for trans and non-binary victims that have turned to substance abuse. And there are a few of them, and I don't have my list with me right now because it's still in storage. But there are a few, um, I want to say like in New York and maybe Los Angeles. And I want to say one like in Michigan or Minnesota or something. I don't remember exactly. But they have like living quarters and stuff to where you are housed specifically with community members. And then they have programs and stuff that they help get you involved with. So even after your treatment, you still can lean on the community. It may be somewhere on my community tab. I'm not exactly sure. But that is something that you can just Google and investigate. Okay, so another aspect of this is physical health problems. While many researchers have linked abuse to various psychological problems, awareness of their linkage to physical medical conditions that become apparent only decades later only began in the mid 1980s. That is when physicians in Kaiser Permanente's Department of Preventive Medicine in San Diego discovered that patients unsuccessfully losing weight in a weight program were the most likely to drop out. This unexpected observation led to the discovery that overeating and obesity were often being used unconsciously as protective solutions to unrecognized problems dating back to childhood. Counterintuitively, obesity provided hidden benefits. It often was sexually, physically, or emotionally protective. Curious about this linkage, Kaiser developed what has become known as the Adverse Childhood Experience Study. Initially reporting on the ACE study included findings from 17,000 patients, mostly middle class, who asked for comprehensive physical exams. The ACE questionnaire asked people about their childhood experiences as well as their current health statuses. Later versions of the survey asked about 10 types of childhood experiences, including child physical, emotional, and sexual abuse. Rather than attempting to measure how severe each type of maltreatment or adverse experience was, or how often it happened, the researchers simply gave out 1 point for each type of adverse experience the patient had experienced. Thus, patients could have scores ranging from 0, had they had experienced none of the listed negative childhood experiences, to 10, where they had experienced them all. Only 1/3 of this middle class population had an ACE score of 0. 1 in 6 had an ACE score of 4 or more. If any one category of abuse of adversity was experienced, there was an 87% likelihood that the person would have also experienced at least one more type. The researchers then matched these patients' ACE scores with their health records. When it came to physical health, they looked at the basic causes underlying the 10 most common causes of death in America. These included tobacco use, with estimated 400,000 deaths annually. Diet and activity patterns, 300,000 deaths. Alcohol use, 100,000 deaths. Sexual behavior, 30,000 deaths. And drug use, 20,000 deaths. Bar charts of the results could not be more striking. For nearly every negative behavior that was measured, the bars steadily rise from the lowest number of drinkers, smokers, etc., among those who had an ACE score of 0 to step by step, the highest reported ACE score, usually 4 or more, or 6 or more. Perhaps most shocking was how much ACE scores were connected to medical conditions such as liver disease, chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, known as COPD, coronary artery disease, and autoimmune diseases. Even after removing all known risk factors such as smoking and high cholesterol, there remained a stepwise increase in the risk of these diseases by how high a patient's ACE score was. In other words, it is not enough to say that adults traumatized as children smoke, eat, and drink more, and therefore have more chronic illnesses. There are additional factors. The researchers believe that not only do trauma survivors attempt to self medicate through alcohol and cigarettes, but also that there is wear and tear on the biological system due to chronic stress. The precise biological mechanisms by which this is taking place have still not been determined, but that did not stop the ACE study researchers from declaring adverse childhood experiences are the main detriment to the health and social well being of the nation. So there you go. There's still a lot to cover: anger, sleep issues, but with this, I'm pretty sure you get the point. There is a lot of stuff that goes along with the aftermath of sexual abuse. If you are dealing with being abused, please reach out to somebody that can help you. You did nothing wrong. You are not dirty. You are not unclean. You did not cause this to happen. You are valid. You are precious. And your life matters. You will be able to find a lot of resources on the community tab. If there is something that you are specifically looking for that is not on the community tab, feel free to leave it in a comment and I will do my best to get you that information. Sexual abuse is horrific. There is a need for harsher laws, longer prison sentences, and stuff in order to get justice for each and every victim. But as a community, we can help the victims become survivors. If anybody needs anything, comment below and I will do my best to find the resources that you desire. Have a good night, everybody.